this past 18 months. I send out a campus update from time to time, and the one that'll go out this afternoon is advertises itself as the COVID update for COVID Day 554. That's the number of days since we first closed our campus for in-person teaching. Thank you for that kind introduction, Don. I appreciate it. And welcome to all of you to the virtual Brushy Fork Leadership Summit for 2021. I gather Eastern Kentucky is well represented and that we have guests from other part of Appalachia too, and even an early riser from Washington State. And I just heard a Corbin resident who's joining us from Mexico. So welcome to my screen from all those places. This is the second year that we've had to hold this event online instead of welcoming you all to visit our beautiful campus. We look forward to the time that we can welcome you back in person. And we hope too that the challenges of the pandemic have not impacted you personally, or that they are causing too many difficulties where you come from, although certainly we can't rule that out. The Brushy Fork Leadership Summit, as Donna said, is intended to provide tools, group experiences, and perspectives that can help you strengthen your leadership. Stating the obvious, we're living in uncertain times. There's politics, of course, but we're also in the midst of a pandemic. And my experience over the last couple of years is that in that case, one just has to be adaptive. This leadership summit explores that very topic, adaptive leadership and how we can accomplish our core work as the ground is shifting beneath us. One interesting thing about crises is that they often tend to unveil and even exacerbate social issues. For leadership, that can be both a challenge and an opportunity. A challenge because the problems may become even more intransigent, but an opportunity because they have often come into clearer view as well. Issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion come to the fore in such a moment, and that's another very important frame through which the adaptive leader has to look at his or her responsibilities. That additional focus of our summit will begin later in this opening session and will continue with a keynote by Jeffrey Canada, well-known founder of the Harlem Children's Zone and advocate for children and youth all over the country, in urban places like Harlem and in rural areas like Appalachia. Since its founding and continuing up even until now, Berea College has been an advocate for and an example of the kind of systemic change that organizations like yours are seeking in your own communities. From a focus on interracial education during the time of slavery to offering equitable educational opportunities for women and men, Berea has been practicing adaptive leadership of our society for systemic change. And we recognize that you are leading similar and important work in communities throughout Appalachia. So we're honored that you have joined us on our virtual campus, and we hope that you leave inspired and strengthened by what you learn here and the partnerships that you forge to continue your good work wherever you are. Thank you, and please enjoy this meeting.
Thank you, President Roloffs. We're pleased that you joined us today. So let's talk real quickly just about what we can expect for the rest of this session today. Of course, we've started our session. We're going to hear, before we get into this presentation about adaptive leadership, Daniel's going to give us an overview of some quick Zoom tips if you're new to the technology, to kind of give you some idea of how to turn your camera off and on, how to mute and unmute yourself and that kind of thing. And also, I should have announced this earlier, I meant to, but we also are going to be recording this session. And so if you don't want your image on a recording, you can turn off your camera and your image won't show up. There's no chance of it showing up. So just keep that in mind. We do want to try to record our sessions. And so if you don't want to be on there, just turn your camera off. And so what we're going to do this session is we're going to hear a little bit about adaptive leadership. We are going to have a Community Accelerator Clinic, which is the community of Grayson has some representatives here, and they are hoping to glean from this leadership summit some things that they can use in the work that they're doing in their community. And so we're going to hear from them. And then we're going to have a session where we consider some issues of equity and go into some small group discussions around that, and really have some conversation about how we can use adaptive leadership and consider equity in the work that we do. And then we'll be wrapped up by about 3:30. And we do have a 15-minute break in there for folks, so that if, if you need a break from your screen for a little while, we'll give you that. And so now Daniel will go through some Zoom tips for you.
Hi, everyone. So at the bottom of your screen, on the toolbar, if you are using your desktop version, there is a little microphone icon that you can click to mute yourself. You will need to click that again to either unmute yourself, or you can press the space bar. If you are joining us today from your mobile device, please tap the screen and the mute button should pop up on your toolbar and you can select it there. Next to the mute button, you should be able to find a video icon. That is to turn your video on and off. So if you need to step away for a moment, or just don't want to have your image showing up on the recording, feel free to click that to stop your video from showing you. Next, in the upper right-hand corner, next to the mute button, you should see 3 little dots. That is an extra menu where you will be able to select the feature to rename yourself. Some of you may be joining from a company or organization account. And so in order to display your actual name or your pronouns, if you would like to do so, feel free to click rename and you will be able to type your new name and your pronouns if you would like to do so. Next, we will be going over the chat bar at the bottom. Click that in order to be able to send a text message to everyone in the group. You can either send this message to everyone that is currently on the call, or you can find the attendees list and send individual private messages to someone. However, please keep in mind that these messages will be able to be viewed by the host. And so just be careful of what you may be sending in that chat. In order to really participate during these sessions, if you have a question or have something that you would like to say, click on reactions and utilize the raise hand icon. This will let the host or one of the assistants know that you would like to contribute in some way or ask a question. When you have been addressed, please remember to click lower your hand so that we know that you have been addressed and that you don't have anything further to say. And then last but not least, in the upper right-hand corner, you will be able to click different ways that you can have the the people that are on the call displayed across your screen, such as having the speaker viewable at all times, or being able to choose how you want the other attendees to be displayed. And then if you have any sort of technological needs or require any support, please feel free to reach out to either myself or Andrea Taban. I will be posting our contact information in the chat now. And also, if you would like to post about us on social media or your time here, please feel free to utilize our hashtag Brushy Fork Berea. And feel free to either text us, send us a message, give us a call, or message us privately in the chat so that we can assist you in anything that you need. Thank you.
Okay, so what are we talking about when we talk about this term adaptive leadership? And we're going to take a look at this and we're going to think about it in the context of clocks and clouds. And so where did this concept of clocks and clouds come from? So there was a philosopher of science in 1966 named Karl Popper, and he wrote a paper that he talked about clocks and clouds. And he basically considered problems to be clocks, that is, with an easily identifiable and technical thing that you could fix, like a cog in a clock, or clouds. And clouds are things that necessitate systemic change, and that really, when you try to address them, they can upset the equilibrium and can take substantial time to address. And so when we're talking about clocks and clouds, we're talking about those technical, cog-like, easy to fix things, or those things that are a little more difficult to grasp. So next slide. So let me tell you a story to start this out. When I was a little girl, a long time ago, in a land far, far away, like Tennessee, I had a watch, and it was a Little Miss Muffet watch that my dad bought me when I was about 4 years old for Christmas. And it was back in the time when you had to wind your watch up every day, you know. Well, I would wind that watch up and until I overwound it and the spring would get stuck. And my dad would fuss at me and say, and try to demand, don't overwind your watch, stop overwinding your watch. And he would take it down to the jewelry store and the little guy would pop the back off of it and fiddle around in there and loosen up that spring and the watch would start to work again. But then, about a week later, here I was, I loved to wind my watch. And I thought, well, if you wind it further, it's going to tick longer. And so wind, and there it would get stuck again. And so he would take it and get it fixed again. Now, that was a very technical problem with that watch. It was easy to identify. I was overwinding that spring, and it was very solvable because we could take it to the watchman. He could pop the back off, fix the spring. It was an issue that my dad tried to solve by authority, but he couldn't quite because he could demand that I not overwind the watch. But for a 4 or 5-year-old to understand the concept of how far can you go till you stop couldn't really be solved by authority. But it was pretty predictable that if I overwound it, then there was gonna be a problem. So this was a very bounded issue, a specific need inside the box. Okay, we can take the watch, get it fixed, move the back off, fix the spring. But there were adaptive issues to this that were more difficult to identify. How do you teach a 4 or 5-year-old to not overwind a watch when she loves to hear the little click, 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 click of the stem winding? This is a shiftable problem, not a problem that can be solved immediately and easily. It's a problem that cannot be solved by authority. It had to be solved by the person who was actually doing the overwinding, and that was me as the 4 or 5-year-old. It was pretty unpredictable how often I was going to overwind that watch. But this was a dynamic and evolving issue because eventually I did learn when to stop winding my watch. And it probably took some experimental discoveries of, oh, if I wind it to this point, that's too far for me to figure it out. And so that's a kind of a simplistic story that tells a little bit of difference between technical and adaptive problems. So basically, these technical problems are really easy to identify. So when we face an issue, our first thought with a technical problem might be to jump to those seemingly very quick solutions that can be managed in-house. Technical problems are solvable. They often lend themselves to that quick and easy, cut and dried solution. Technical problems can be solved by authority and expertise. We might develop a new procedure to solve a technical problem or a new rule about how something should be done or something should operate. And there may even be an opportunity to bring in an outside consultant or some authority who understands a problem and they can fix it for you. Technical problems generally have more predictable solutions that allow people to feel in control. And so they are generally more receptive to those technical solutions because they fit within their current roles and their current framework and ways of thinking. Technical problems and their solutions usually have those clear boundaries. They may require just changes in 1 or 2 ways that we're doing things, 1 or 2 places in our organizations, and they can be focused internally within our organizations. And this is particularly attractive, I think, when we are working in very small nonprofits with small staffs and limited staff capacity. So it's easier to go toward those technical problems. And technical problems and solutions can be tied to that specific need, as we said. And this is why they can often be implemented by edict by somebody or, and can be implemented quickly. Now, sometimes these technical solutions are the way to go. But what happens when you try to approach a problem that is an adaptive challenge with a technical solution? You may not always get the result that you need. And so let's think then about adaptive challenges. And adaptive challenges, as I said, are more difficult to identify. And we may even have to recognize that we are denying their existence because they're hard to identify. And we may actually find more power in asking questions than in providing answers. Now, many of us as leaders got to where we are because we can provide answers to people. And so thinking instead, well, what if I ask questions instead of providing answers may not be natural to us and can be uncomfortable, particularly if our work is facing significant transition. So these adaptive challenges are shiftable, so they may require shifting frameworks and not implementing those quick solutions. And as leaders, we may actually find ourselves exploring things like our values, our beliefs, the different roles that we take, our relationships, and just our overall approaches to the work that we're doing. So because of this, an adaptive challenge actually requires the people with the problem to solve the problem. And so you have to put the work where the work belongs. And again, that's not always natural to us as leaders because we are accustomed to knowing the answers and providing the answers. But what we're really going to do with an adaptive challenge is work with people to examine how we might shift our values, our beliefs, our roles, our relationships, and our approaches. And it's really important that we as leaders engage people in the way we are reframing things. So obviously, if you're asking a lot of questions instead of providing answers, then adaptive challenges are unpredictable and they're murkier and they feel less controllable to people. And so as leaders, we have to become comfortable with not knowing and not knowing the answers all the time, and recognizing that questions and delving into deep questions can be good ways and good tools to use as we try to move forward dealing with adaptive challenges. And because adaptive challenges, again, require people to move outside their comfort zone, because they're unpredictable, again, they may even resist acknowledging them. Adaptive challenges are dynamic and evolving. And again, they're breaking outside boundaries oftentimes, boundaries that would otherwise make people feel comfortable. And so in the context of that, we may actually ask the people that are working with us to redefine their roles and in a way to become self-authoring in the way that they're approaching their work, rather than having a prescribed role within an organization. And that's not always comfortable for people. Because they like to know exactly the direction that they're going and may not feel experienced enough or comfortable enough to do that kind of self-authoring. And so because of the interconnectedness between organizations, the people we seek to serve, and the people that we're working with who are serving with us, then the solutions to adaptive challenges sometimes require these kinds of experimental discoveries that we talk about. They can take a long time to implement, and they could have some trial and error along the way. And so we have to become learning organizations and individual learners as leaders to do that. So next slide, please. We go to one more slide. So, well, as nonprofit leaders, we actually live in both worlds. Will this slide advance? Well, we're going to continue with this slide. That is fine. So we do live in both worlds as nonprofit leaders and as community leaders as well. And so we're working within both technical and adaptive kinds of roles. And so we have to figure out whether or not we are working with problems that are easy to identify or difficult to identify. We may have to become comfortable with not knowing. We may have to be comfortable with not being an authority and allowing other people to solve the problems and to come with us with solutions. And we may need to really spend some time thinking outside the box and becoming comfortable with those kinds of experimental discoveries. And so as we move ahead in the Leadership Summit and you're thinking about adaptive leadership, what I would like for you to do as you participate in your workshop tracks is consider this question: how does what I am learning position me to practice adaptive leadership? And so that's what we hope you will do as you move through your tracks. And you're going to find in your workshop tracks that there are both technical aspects to the leadership skills that you're learning and also these adaptive ones. But we'd like for you to really seriously focus on those adaptive leadership skills. So thank you for that. And now we are going to launch into the community clinic that we talked about with Grayson, Kentucky.
All right, so I'm looking for Robert Donnan to start us off here.
Hey, can you all hear me? Sorry, I was having some computer glitches. All right, so we are including this session showcasing the What's Next East Kentucky Community Accelerator team in Grayson today as part of the opening session and also as part of the closing leadership session on Friday the 24th. For everybody who's here to have an opportunity to listen to representatives from Grayson share about the community and economic development projects that they're working on. You'll likely hear ideas today that you can bring back to your own community development efforts. And then after attending your Leadership Summit workshop tracks over the next 2 weeks, They'll also have a chance to share takeaways from your workshop tracks and other advice for Grayson on how you can maybe offer some advice to support them in their projects. And Robert Donnan is joining us today from Hazard, Kentucky. He's a community and economic development consultant and small business coach who focuses on creative economic downtown revitalization, community investments, and building entrepreneurial ecosystems. He's worked extensively in Eastern Kentucky and across Central Appalachia for the past 2 decades. He also serves as regional partner and steering committee member for the regional volunteer network, What's Next East Kentucky. And he's going to share a little bit more about the Community Accelerator. And then after we hear from Dan and Mindy Flick, Sharon Grayson, he'll lead us in a short group discussion.
Jacqueline, I think your sound just went out again. So if you can put the first slide up for me, that would be great. Howdy, everybody. As she said, I'm Robert Donnan. And Donna, I just want to thank you for that presentation about the difference between technical and adaptive challenges. I feel like growing up, my parents wanted me to solve technical things, and I was racing off to solve the adaptive things. So I was several decades ahead of them, but I still had to live by their rules while I was in their house. What this presentation today is going to talk about a pilot program that's been created that will really emphasize adaptive problem solving, adaptive leadership, and adaptive problem solving. It's called the Communities in Action Accelerator. And can we get that slide up? Maybe. If not, I'll wing it. I mean, I'm adaptive, right? So, all right, I'm just going to go ahead and start telling you about it. I'm going to introduce you to the idea of what a community action accelerator is. And then we're going to switch to Dan and Mindy Click at the Grayson Art Gallery and Art Center in Grayson and Carter County. And they're going to talk about some of the groundwork they're laying for the accelerator, which we're going to do a pilot of in their community. What we want from you today is to basically listen a little bit to me to kind of get the structure, but then really, really go deep when you talk to Dan and Mindy here in a minute and listen to what they're doing, because we're going to put a link in the chat, which will let you ask questions, give ideas. Just basically what we want you to do is respond to what we're setting up and say, what would you want to know if you were doing this? So I'm going to start off by telling you that this was created by Ruthie Caldwell, who is the project manager and founder, grant writer for her own company out of Pike County called Vision Granted, and Jeffrey Justice, who is the current business expansion retention director for the city of Pikeville. Formerly, he was with SOAR. What I want to tell you is that they met at the Bright Leadership Development Conference. And so we're really excited with What's Next East Kentucky to have Ruthie's leadership and Jeffrey's too. Oh, by the way, in case you didn't notice, my internet is unstable. So occasionally I'll drop out, but trust me, you haven't missed anything. The bottom line is that they brought this idea, and What's Next East Kentucky is partnering with Dan and Mindy and Grayson to do a pilot and test it out. It came from, it was inspired, I should say, by working with a model of a business accelerator program called Co-Starters, which some of you may be familiar with as SOAR. It's a 10-week program. They've so far done 6 cohorts in Moorhead, Pikeville, Prestonsburg, Whitesburg, London, and Hazard, and have 45 graduates. And what this did was take some startup entrepreneurs through a program that really helped them build a model for what their business needed to look like and how it would function. So what we are interested in doing, hey, here we go. Well, I'll have to go backwards now. No, not really. Can we advance the slide to number 4? There. So whoops. Well, okay, skip number 4. That's all right. Number 4, the next one. Okay, so what Ruthie and Jeffrey asked themselves was, if SOAR is having success with a business accelerator, why not a community accelerator? that could help communities take local action that was in line with the SOAR blueprint. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so as most of you probably know, 47% of all the counties in Appalachia that are declared to be distressed are, well, this is more adaptive than I had counted on. But 47% of the counties that are distressed are in Eastern Kentucky. SOAR responded several years ago by developing what they call the SOAR blueprint, meeting with community members, and they came up with a list including broadband connectivity, 21st century workforce, entrepreneurship in the digital economy, healthy communities, industrial development, regional food systems, and tourism and downtown development. What's Next East Kentucky echoes a lot of these themes about what our network that we have been developing over the last 4.5 years is doing, is trying to bring local communities together in a collaborative network for mutual learning, work together on projects, and basically see if peer-to-peer communities can help one another solve some of these challenges that I just named. Okay, the next slide, please. And as you can see, in addition to the network of communities, we are building a network of over 200 public and private partners throughout the region that can bring resources to the table to help us do this. So the pilot program that is already in a planning stage grant right now will identify communities. Grayson is one of them, to lay the groundwork for building this what I'm going to tell you about. And in each community, it's going to bring together teams of local people that can meet and help work on these challenges, which, as we know, are adaptive. Okay, next slide, please. The recommended members of each team in each of the communities, such as Grayson, represent the diversity of the community. So it has local government, local chamber, Main Street, economic development organization, business people, nonprofits, educations, and it can include the faith-based community and others as well. Next slide, please. The possible focus areas, meaning the skills that they would want to develop or bring to the table, including convening, asset mapping, thinking about innovation and community strategy development, like how to not just do what we've always done, but break new ground, project management tools, fundraising, grant and project administration, measuring impact, and sharing best practices. Okay, next. Now, to help support this, I mentioned this sort of parallel network to the communities within What's Next East Kentucky of the regional resource providers. So we're developing, with their help, a toolkit of what's available in Eastern Kentucky that can help these groups in each community learn to solve their problems and address challenges. So we're going to organize them by the stage that they're facing the challenge, like getting started, planning, solving the problem, and then sharing what they're learning with their peers in other communities. And then by type, it basically maps those elements of the SOAR blueprint that I described earlier. Next, please. So we got a grant initially to assess our resources, build a team, and identify the needs that the accelerator program will focus on. And right in a moment, you're going to hear from Grayson about how they're laying the groundwork with this grant. Next slide. Now, we also have a USDA planning grant. And so this Just Transition Foundation grant feeds into that starting at the end of this month. It'll be a 1-year pilot program to prototype, test, and refine the regional toolkit that I described, and also the Community Accelerator program. That goes for 1 year, but next spring, we're going to apply for an implementation grant. It may be through the ARC Power grant structure, or it may again be with USDA. We'll make during that year, provided we get it, and we hope we will. They've been very encouraging so far. We'll take the toolkit, make it available to the public, just meaning anybody that wants to download it and learn what's online through the What's Next East Kentucky website. And then during that year, the Community Accelerator program will be open to any community in Eastern Kentucky that wishes to join or sustain their membership in the network. Now, I'm going to say that part again. It will be open to any community in Eastern Kentucky that gets interested. We'll have a lot more data and evidence at that point of how it's working and what it can accomplish. And you'll be able to meet folks again, like Dan and Mindy, who have already had a year's experience at that point. If you're interested in doing it, we'll organize the cohorts in groups of 4 or more communities participating together. So you would be able to collaborate with other communities, even as you learn these skills, to help sort of bring the skills to application in your community to meet the challenges that you've identified. Every community will identify its own challenges, like Grayson may work on broadband, another might work on the creative economy. It will be up to you how to do that, but the overall structure and skills will address whatever challenge that you come up with. Okay, next, please. So again, in the chat, there's a link where you'll be able to think about what you would want to gain from a community toolkit, but I really want you to respond to what you hear in just a moment from Dan and Mindy about what they're doing and what advice you would give them, what questions you would ask them, how that relates to what you're interested in. And it could be around team building, funding, asset mapping, sustainability, regional resources. Like, how can you put the word out that you have a problem you want help solving, networking, diversity and inclusion, and then attracting people downtown, whether local residents or visitors. This is the gist of it. And that was a pretty fast thing. I think it'll make more sense when you hear Dan and Mindy talk to you. Dan is the director of the Grayson Gallery and Arts Center there in Grayson and Art County and Carter County. Mindy is the chairman of the Tourism Commission and also the Park Board. What they really are innovators and doers and a lot of fun. I've been to some of their events and I can tell you right now, it was some of the best time I've spent in a creative setting in anywhere in Eastern Kentucky. So Dan and Mindy, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you, Robert.
Thanks, Robert.
We appreciate it. We appreciate all you do for everyone. We are, just like the rest of you in this group, folks who want to help our communities. And so we've been doing the things that we all do to try to improve our communities. And we were brought this idea through What's Next EKY. We are steering committee members of that also, to try to develop a community accelerator project and come up eventually with a toolkit that will help community members advance the ideas that they're already trying in their communities, to give them some ideas and some help and some resources to call on, no matter what status, what state of community development that they're in. So we decided to organize our community accelerator project around 2 issues: broadband and downtown revitalization. 2 huge things for all of us in Eastern Kentucky. We started out with having small meetings, starting with the Rotary Club, talking about broadband and how we could expand broadband, good service throughout the entire county. We did link up with Sabrina McWhorter with SOAR, and she is on our committee also. We had our meetings. We set up our executive committee like we were supposed to. Our committee includes people in service clubs, the mayor, county judge, 911, and we felt like we were communicating well and making good progress. We have a new 64-acre sports and recreation park that just opened, just a little bit on the edge of town, and the park needs good internet service so that they can stream the games, or and so that people have access while they're in the park. So also the park manager and our small community of individuals, we were contacting Windstream and Spectrum, and we were annoying people, basically talking to them and calling them and trying to find out who's the next person to talk to, et cetera. And we feel like we were making some progress because we did hear some good feedback from Windstream, who's our main provider. Can't help that. And then we had a get together where our committee said, well, we can't move on with a feasibility study for the county until we get over 10% of our population to do a speed test. And we tried various ways of pushing that out there, on Facebook, and 911 folks asked and the library folks asked. But then we said to ourselves, well, what would be wrong with us sitting down as a group and entering all those addresses and doing it for the people? So our 911 folks brought in addresses, and we sat down in a group and we entered all those, and we were able to get our speed test percentage above 10%, which then meant that the county could do the feasibility study. And we know there's all kinds of money coming from the federal government down to communities to improve broadband service. So we were really pleased and really happy about it and felt like we were doing a great thing. And then all of a sudden we heard that the city council had a meeting and a Windstream representative had shown up and said, hey, we will invest $500,000 if you will invest $250,000, and we'll make sure you have broadband service within your city limits and 2 miles outside of that. And the city council said, hey, that's a great idea, let's do it. So, there was a lack of communication there with our committee and us trying to find out about grant monies that might be available to pay for the part the city would have to pay for. And they've just gone ahead and decided to enter into this agreement. So we feel like we were left out of that process. And at this point, we're also having trouble getting any feedback from the county government, because we keep asking them, okay, well, we made sure that we got above our 10% and we've been meeting, and what's going on with the county and where is the feasibility study in this process? And we just haven't been successful in getting any more feedback from them. One of our committee members said, it seems like when the government doesn't have any money, they want their people involved to do the work. But then if they have money in their pockets, then they just kind of leave us behind. So that is one of our problems right now that we could use some advice with, is how do we keep this effort cohesive and keep our people involved in the whole process. So that's where we are on our broadband initiative. The other initiative, downtown revitalization, it is so important for all of our small towns, all of our main streets. So we decided to start with an application to get back into the Kentucky Main Street program. We had Kitty Dogood do a Zoom presentation to our Chamber of Commerce to get them interested. And they said, oh, that sounds like a great idea, let's do it. So we formed a small committee to start working on the downtown application. And when you get into it, it's not just your name and your address and your population. There's a whole lot of information that has to go on that application. And we have a small group working on it. So we need to find out how to get people more involved and interested and excited about that to get the darned paperwork in. I think we're going to get a little bit of assistance financially from the city. They seem pretty agreeable on that. But we haven't made much progress with the application. So we could use some input from you all on how to push that forward. Ruthie Caldwell had told us about an open space meeting concept. She said it worked really well in other communities, Pikeville, for instance. It gathers around what we want to do in downtown on Main Street. We set up an open space meeting, which I had never heard of before, but she said the concept is everyone who shows up, they're the people who are supposed to be there, and they're the ones who will have the ideas that need to happen. We called ours Grayson Creative Community, and we had it at one of our committee members' dance studios downtown. So you can see those beautiful mirrors along the wall there. And Dan was able to take markers and draw out Main Street from one end to the other and all its features there, so that the attendees could look and visualize in their minds what was there and what wasn't. So we started out with people talking about what they love about Main Street. And we had little pink sticky notes and they wrote that, here's what I love about Grayson and downtown. And we put those sticky notes up so we could refer to those. And then Ruthie Caldwell said the next step was we were to send them out on Main Street with different colored sticky notes, one for challenges and one for opportunities. And Ruthie wasn't able to be there at the meeting to help us facilitate. So we were a little bit nervous because we didn't know if people would talk to each other, and we didn't know if they'd actually get up and walk on Main Street and do what we told them to do. But surprisingly, they did. They were very cooperative. So they took their little sticky notes and they walked up and down Main Street and they wrote down challenges on one color and they wrote down opportunities on the other color of the sticky notes. Then they came back together and discussed those ideas so that they could distill those down into about 4 or 5 ideas, main ideas on what they want to focus on. So here's the group, and they're actually interacting and talking about things, and they came up with 5 different areas of concern, and I'm sure most of these are concerns in all of our communities these days. We all have vacant buildings downtown, and there are challenges in knowing who owns them and what can be done with them, how to fill those vacant buildings. There, cleaning and painting was another subject that was identified, just cleaning up downtown and painting some of the building facades that aren't looking so good. But our questions were, how do we learn what we can legally do with somebody else's building? We talked about a vacant lot downtown. There's an area where a building had burnt several years ago, and now it's just growing up in weeds, and people next door who have the store next door are parking there. And so they talked about some ideas on how to make that vacant lot work as a gathering space downtown. The Grayson Tourism Commission looked at it and the building next door and have decided to purchase those properties. So we also wanted some input on what the community thought should be done with those spaces when they are purchased. And they came up with some great ideas on gathering space and lighting and music and all kinds of outdoor activities. Now, a couple of things that came up that we didn't expect. Signage was one subject that I hadn't thought of. Downtown merchants said that there's no way for folks who are just passing through on the main drag going up to Grayson Lake, there's no way for them to know that we have a downtown shopping district because there's nothing to tell them that. So signage was another subject that came up that people are really interested in, but we need to know where we can legally place those signs and what the ordinances are locally for signage and how we can do that legally and meet all the requirements. We have this new 64-acre park, and the park manager sitting there in the green t-shirt, a lot of had said, bring me your information and I'll share it with all these thousands of new people who are coming to town. And the downtown merchants were saying, well, why aren't you advertising us? And he said, I can't search out your information. You bring it and we can showcase it. So there's a bit of disconnect between different groups there also. So that's another problem that we're seeing, that we could really use some advice or input on how to address those problems. So our next step, we took notes, we wrote down all the details of these 5 separate subjects that people are interested in addressing downtown. We sent all that information to Ruthie Caldwell, and she's going to put that into a report for us that we can take back to our group at the end of this month. And we're hoping to find some short-term projects that are not very expensive that we can do pretty much immediately so that people are seeing immediate results and, something visible that so they can feel like, yes, we had some input. We went to a meeting It wasn't just another meeting where we talked and nothing came out of it, but actually some results happened. And we feel like that is going to allow us to build up more interest and enthusiasm around downtown and improving it.
So folks, we are very short of time, so we're not going to go through a full-scale brainstorming exercise like I promised. So I'm calling on all of you to be adaptive leaders, and I just put the link back up in the chat, and either now or during the break that we'll have at 30, think about, jot down a couple of things that you would ask or ask of Grayson about what they're doing, or suggest that you might want to learn about or advise them about. So again, sorry for the rush brainstorming period, but we really appreciate your input. Thanks so much. Back to you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And there will be an opportunity, just so everybody knows, on our closing session on Friday for people to share some resources again. And so we do hope that if you learn things over the next, as you're doing your workshop tracks over the next several days, that you think about, oh, we could bring this to Grayson and tell them about it. So we encourage you to do that.
All right, there we go.
And Mindy for presenting, and I'm going to turn it over to Martina Jackson.
Thank you. I'm Martina Jackson. I am a newer member of the Brushy Fork team, so I'm very happy to see the faces that are joining us today. I'm excited to see amazing examples of adaptive leadership and happening right on the community level. Next, we will have Dr. Jessica Klanderud and Dr. Chad Berry. They will speak to equity and adaptive leadership. And this session, I think, will be very thought-provoking and engaging for an emerging leader or a more seasoned leader, and will give you some great information to use as we move forward in this session. To give you a little bit of background on our presenters today, Dr. Jessica Klanderud is the director of the Carter G. Woodson Center for Interracial Education and an assistant professor of African and African American history at Berea College. She received her master's degree and PhD in history from Carnegie Mellon University, where she studied African American history, American history, comparative slavery, and the history of poverty in America. She is currently working on a manuscript entitled Struggle for the Street, Civil Rights in Pittsburgh from a Place to a Movement, a study of formal and informal power on the streets during the Civil Rights Movement in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Her research focuses on neighborhood street level dynamics of class and race as African Americans define their own spaces in the 20th century. Dr. Chad Berry is the Vice President for Alumni, Communications, and Philanthropy, and Professor of Appalachian Studies and History. Dr. Berry has authored, edited, or co-edited 4 books. He is the author of Southern Migrants, Northern Exiles, which examines the migrations of millions of white Southerners to the Midwest during the 20th century. The book was inspired by his paternal grandparents, who reluctantly left Tennessee in the 1940s, going first to Akron, Ohio, and ultimately settling in, hopefully I say this right, Mishawaka, Indiana, where they found jobs and economic opportunity that eluded them in the South. And I will now turn it over to our presenters.
Hello, I'm sharing my screen, so give me one moment to do this and then we'll be ready. So can everyone see my screen now? Good, I always get a little anxious about that when we're doing these things on Zoom. So thank you all for joining us this afternoon. I'm so excited to be co-leading this with Dr. Berry and to spend some time considering what equity means in our community. I want to begin our plenary here with a video that exposes a particular moment in the history of the region that I think is really important for us to consider as a group.
On Halloween night, 1919, Whites in Corbin, Kentucky, a railroad town of 3,400, drove African Americans onto railroad cars at gunpoint and shipped them to Knoxville, Tennessee. During the trip, 2 white switchmen lost all their money in a poker game with African American track layers. The white switchmen claimed these African Americans had robbed them. Crossing over the state border, signs at both the northern and southern borders of Scott County, Tennessee announced, "Don't let the sun set on your head." After the Civil War, coal companies needed a workforce willing to do dirty and dangerous work. Labor agents from the coal companies traveled the South, recruiting people to move from southern to central Appalachia. Companies built segregated factory towns to house laborers and to better monitor their work. These laborers came from diverse backgrounds. They were poor Irish, Scottish, Eastern European, and African American. Blacks were especially attracted to these new opportunities as they attempted to escape racial terror in the South. Between the Civil War and World War II, there was a growing sentiment that the presence of blacks should not be tolerated, as many of these segregated factory towns became majority white. Many of these factory towns segregated their black workers into neighborhoods where only black people lived. Appalachian white citizens would create sundown towns, where any blacks present would be required to leave the town by sundown or face racial terror. Beginning around 1890, whites began to expel African Americans from nearly the entire Cumberland Plateau, a swath 50 miles wide, extending from West Virginia through Kentucky and Tennessee into northern Alabama. 20 counties in eastern Kentucky had 3,482 blacks. In just 10 years, that number was reduced to 531. Appalachia was not always all white. It was originally a tri-racial society made up of white, black, and native indigenous people. Appalachia became white as black and native people were pushed out due to violence and pulled to job opportunities in nearby cities. The legacies of this tri-racial society remain if we know where to look.
So this leads me into a lot of my conversation today about what we view as the character of Appalachia and how we can reckon with some of this troubling and difficult history that we have to help us all grow together in our ability to adapt and face the troubles that we have in the future as we go forward. So one of the things that struck me the most when I was reading about this triracial history of Appalachia specifically was the very predominant presence of sundown towns in the Cumberland Plateau specifically. So when we think about this kind of racial terror and racial violence, unfortunately, many times people think of the Deep South and the Cotton Belt, the places really sort of tarnished by the legacy of slavery and by the violence associated with that system. But sundown towns are actually a little bit different. Most sundown towns were primarily located outside of the South. They weren't in the Cotton Belt. They were in formerly Union strongholds that then embraced the push and pull of white supremacy sort of later after the Civil War, and actually embraced a lot of the legacy of the Confederate lost cause as well. And so one of the ways that you can see some of this happening is if you look at the picture there with the map, that highlights where the majority of sundown towns were located. So the Cumberland Plateau was really the central kind of focal point of a lot of this interracial tension between white working class laborers and Black working class laborers. Sundown a part of this problem of pushing out of African American residents from Appalachia. So as the video described, this image of a mob of people driving Black residents out of the city of Corbin was not uncommon at all. It was actually a part of the process of towns becoming sundown towns over time. This push of racial terror violence tended to move African Americans out of rural Appalachian communities and into nearby cities. And this is why when I talk about the African American population of Appalachia, one of the things that I point out is that when we look at the large African American populations that grow and develop in cities on the edges of Appalachia, those Black residents in those towns are no less Appalachian. They are refugees. They were pushed out of the Appalachian region and into urban communities, along with folks that were being pushed out of rural areas into urban areas. So those patterns continue with Black residents earlier, and then white poor residents from the rural Appalachian counties get pushed into urban areas in the same sort of way. And over time, these Black residents of Appalachia, former Black residents of Appalachia, get pulled toward industrial jobs in the urban north and the urban west, and actually in the urban south as well. So you see people getting pulled to cities that are these kind of former Appalachian residents that still maintain Appalachian values, that raise their children with knowledge of their Appalachian heritage, but yet they are unable to kind of live into their idea of their home place because of this push of racial terror violence in many of the counties of rural Appalachia. So this brings me to a kind of a big question. What discrimination costs everyone? Very frequently, when we talk about racial discrimination, we think about the effect that it has on Black people. And that is something that is a true part of the system. It does affect people that are targeted by racial violence and by racial discrimination. But racism actually causes everyone to feel negative effects. It is not something that is only negative toward people who are people of color. It has effects on white people as well. The overall work of race is actually to divide us from each other. It is not to bring us together. It is to create false separation. And very frequently, if you look at past examples, you can see cases where interracial coalitions, especially within the labor movement, have shown that white people and Black people and all kinds of other people, Native American and Indigenous people as well, have worked together. And our greatest gains have happened when we all can work together. But those racial divisions are sewn in there to help us think of each other as other, to help think of this issue of the life that we have as a zero-sum game. And the principle of a zero-sum game is that in order for me to win, someone else must lose.
Dr. Klanderud, I hate to interrupt. I just want to let you know that I believe some of your Zoom toolboxes may be covering some of your PowerPoint content. So you may need to move some of the, there you go. And I believe there's one over your slide title as well.
Better?
Yes, thank you. I apologize.
Oh, no, I appreciate actually here, I can hide floating meeting controls too, which should help. Is that better?
You now have one right in the center of your presentation. It just went away. Okay.
Okay.
I think you're good.
All right, appreciate that. So to go back to this idea of a zero-sum game. So the idea of in order for some people to win, other people must lose. It's important to point out that justice work is not a zero-sum game. So policies that advance justice for one group actually advance justice for everyone. So if you think about this as looking for win-win scenarios for your region and for your people, if you advance justice for those that are poor and marginalized, those goals are going to advance things for African Americans and for Indigenous people and for people on the margins of society generally, while they also advance for people in the dominant group that happen to also be poor. So this work, it helps raise all boats at the same time. It's also important that we think about what demographic shifts are coming in the region as well. So Appalachia is changing. And so to continue to lead effectively, diversity and equity must be a part of the conversation. If you look at the demographic shifts just happening currently, we have quite a few more LGBTQIA population living in the region. We have quite a few more Latinx population living in the region. And all of this is just a sign of the larger demographic changes that are happening in the nation. So as a result, prioritizing equality for everyone really helps, again, raise all those boats together, but it also helps you plan effectively for the future. So instead of thinking just of what your community looks like now and how you would like to change those things, what will your community or sphere look like in 10 to 20 years? And how can you center equity for everyone? These kinds of questions help us really focus the work that we're doing, not just on racial discrimination, but how everybody can come together and work to help break some of these historical stereotypes, but also to really lean in to the past of Appalachia as this triracial society that was making gains for everyone before we began to walk some of those gains back. Now, I'm going to shift over to Dr. Berry now, and I will happily advance the slides as you let me know when to do so.
Thank you, Jess. Hi, everyone. It's an honor to be here with you today. So what exactly is equity? I've given you a definition here on the screen. And one way that I like to define equity is simply to say that equity is about treating unequal things unequally. Treating unequal things unequally. In fact, Socrates wrote about this concept in the ancient world. True equality would be treating unequal things equally. And there's a difference there. Many of you have probably, or if you haven't done this, if you Google, for example, do a Google image search using the word equity, and you'll see a very common graphic that has three people trying to watch what I think is a baseball game behind a fence. And true equality has three boxes of all the same height onto which people are trying to stand. A taller person, a medium height person, and sometimes a person in a wheelchair. Well, the tall person can get on that box and see over the fence and watch the game. The medium height person standing on the same height of a box, if that person stands on tiptoes, can barely see over the fence, the person in a wheelchair can't even access the box. That's equality, providing everyone the same sized box. Equity, on the other hand, would be not having to provide a box to the tall person because the tall person can see over the fence. The medium height person might get two boxes so that that person can see over the fence and watch the game. The person in the wheelchair still can't use any box because the wheelchair can't access it. So a ramp tall enough for the person to see over the fence really involves equity. And then there are all kinds of manifestations of these graphics, because true justice would be removing the fence in the first place, right? So equity really is about responding to people's different needs. That's where the notion of treating unequal things unequally comes into play. And equity is in contrast to equality. Next slide, Jess. Jess has been talking about so compellingly about Appalachia as a triracial society. It's often something that I emphasize in my own classes, because if most people close their eyes and think about the person that comes to mind when somebody mentions Appalachian, it probably isn't an Indigenous person or person of color, because we've been taught to conceive of the region and its people as white, when in fact that notion belies the historical early origins of Appalachia, until, as Jess's compelling video shows, many people of color were run out of towns, especially on the Cumberland Plateau. It was also whitewashed because amid an unprecedented amount of immigration in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, people who, quote unquote, discovered Appalachia as the bastion, the last remaining bastion, if you will, of white Anglo-Saxon Protestantism, made it such that that notion of Appalachia was inconceivable with that triracial origin. So, you know, so the story goes, if white people running around the mountains in Appalachia were supposedly speaking in Shakespearean dialects long extinct on the British Isles, that's not true, in fact. But if that were the notion of Appalachia, then you can see how incompatible that definition was with a much more accurate triracial past and even triracial present. So Appalachia was made white, as Jess has already said. And I always say to students and people that I speak with rather emphatically that Appalachia is the most misunderstood region in this country. And that is so because of the particular function that Appalachia and its people serve in the popular mind, full of stereotypical notions, either out of a nostalgia for the past or real fear and anxiety about the present and the future. So if you have, if in your community as an Appalachian community, you have this burden of having assumptions that have been explicitly taught, but often in a subconscious way about people in the region, that's a burden. But there's an additional burden for people of color, for example, in the long and unfortunate and tragic history of race in this country. It's an additional layer, if you will. So I think striving to be as inclusive and equitable a community as possible is in the best interest. It's in the best interest of justice and fairness and inclusion and equity and the dignity of all people. Next slide. There are people of color in the mountains. It takes some effort to see them. It takes some effort to listen to them. It takes some effort to include them if you are not used to this kind of equity work. And that is a point that I believe that I certainly want to hammer home today in the interest of a just Appalachian future. Because as you know, the history of Appalachia has been quite unjust, unfair. If the country was built on white supremacy, as I indeed believe it was, it should not be surprising that Appalachia, being squarely a part of this country's history and its past, just our slide view just got really small, by the way. There it goes. Not sure why Zoom or PowerPoint is playing tricks on us. But the Appalachian region is no exception to the white supremacist basis upon which this country was founded. So if you fail to fail to be mindful of that fact, then you're really, you're certainly not helping to advance justice. You're actually probably helping to perpetuate injustice. And I often believe and talk with students about notions of justice and use the metaphorical notion of the pie, that there seems to be only finite numbers of pieces of a pie. And when justice and equity work involves trying to, the perception goes, trying to take 8 pieces of pie and divide those 8 into 40. And that's just a wrong-headed notion. The number of pieces in this country of pie are in fact unlimited. It's just that they're very inequitably distributed. They're inequitably distributed. The Kellogg Foundation several years ago estimated what the increase would be to the gross domestic, to GDP, if in fact we were a far more equitable society. And that's very compelling. It suggests that there are unlimited pieces of pie, and the work of equity involves distributing those pieces as equitably as we can. So it doesn't, there's a false dichotomy if our community does this, reaches out to this group of people, then this group of people will suffer some sort of loss. When in fact, I strongly believe that that community as a whole will gain because of the richness and the new understanding and the perspectives and the learning across difference that can take place. Jess?
So as we prepare to move toward our discussion time, I want you to take a few moments to journal and reflect on what skills that you have in adaptive leadership of a diverse workforce and what areas you'd like to grow in your adaptive leadership. So as we've discussed equity here in our brief time together so far, I want you to think about how you can incorporate some of those skills that you may already have in leading a diverse workforce and how you'd like to grow in your adaptive leadership. And while you do that, we'll also be heading toward our break shortly. So Donna, I don't know if you want to give them some instructions on how much time for journaling and how much time for break, but that would be useful intervention at this point.
Okay, sure. So why don't we do 5 minutes for journaling and 10 minutes for a break? And that brings us back here about 2:35.
Perfect.
So it puts us about 5 minutes off, but we're, I think, in good shape even with that. So 5 minutes for journaling, 10 minutes for break. Please be back at 2:35. Feel free to turn off your cameras and take care of yourselves, and we'll see you back at 2:35.
And again, just mute yourself and turn off your camera. Please do not leave the session.
Hello, everyone. It is 2:35, so I will assume that we're in the process of coming back from our break. So let me go ahead and show this next slide here that'll help set us up for our discussion times and our breakout rooms. So at this point, I hope you've had an opportunity to read the common reading that we sent along on racial color blindness from the Kirwan Institute. And what it talks about, in case you didn't get a chance to look at it or as a refresher, it looks at racial color blindness as a way of thinking that opposes racial categories and categorical social perception. The research report outlines two common premises underlying racial color blindness as an idea and talks about ways that you can undo racial color blindness as a way of approaching people of difference in your area. So soon we are going to break into some breakout rooms and we're going to look at the two discussion questions listed below. So question 1 is, how have you seen or experienced racial color blindness in your capacity as a leader? And how did the research report support or challenge your thinking? And then question 2 is, drawing from your journaling prompt, what have you learned from this session that you plan to incorporate as you grow in your adaptive leadership? So Donna, if you're there, can you help explain how we're going to do these breakout rooms?
Sure. So Andrea is going to put us into breakout rooms and those will be anonymously assigned. So we're just going to be randomly put out into breakout rooms. Each breakout room will have a facilitator to help us work through these questions. And I'm actually putting the questions in the chat right now, so they should be in our breakout rooms when we get there. And we will discuss these discuss these questions maybe for about 15 minutes. And then come back and have a discussion as the whole group about what we talked about and just share some learnings that we may have had. So Andrea is working on those. I'm going to get this. Oh, and it looks like Jacqueline got the second question into the chat. And those should, I think, go with you into your breakout rooms. So you'll be able to see the questions there as well. So Andrea, when you're ready, if you want to place us in our breakout rooms. And folks, when you get put into the breakout room, you might get a prompt that says you've been assigned to room 1, 2, 3, whatever. Just click that prompt and they'll send you there, or it may send you automatically. I've seen it work both ways. And you will automatically be brought back to the larger meeting as well, just to be clear about that. So.
Yes, and I believe we will be back in 20 minutes, but I will show you guys prompts with how many minutes you have left so you don't feel cut off. So I'm going to send everybody in a breakout room right now.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. How are we feeling so far?
Well, how are you?
All right, it looks like we still got some folks joining. All right, so it looks like everyone has been placed. So to start us off, do we have any volunteers of who would like to speak to how they've seen or experienced racial color blindness in their capacity as a leader?
I would say that the most frequent expression I hear is I see no color in a lot of spaces that I work with. And it could be any conversation that's not even related to race, that the comment comes out. And it tends to be present in various workplace and community settings for me.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to share?
I'll echo Susie. I feel like a lot of times I hear the racial color blindness coming from people of authority that have a little bit higher authority than I do. And so it sometimes is not awkward, but it kind of feels like you're challenging in the workplace, especially challenging people's ideas, your boss's ideas, people who are in authority over you, their ideas. When you bring up the idea that maybe there's racial disparity like within the system, and then one of the first things out of their mouth is, well, I don't see color. It's not about color. I just see what's on the paper they brought to me, or like specifically a specific example is like when you do job applications, it tends to kind of pass over people who have racial color blindness, that just because you put the job application out there, minority groups aren't seeing it because they might not have access to the platforms that you're using. So that's just kind of one example of where I see it in my current work environment.
Definitely. And I definitely resonate with that last section, especially about the accessibility of some of the materials or applications that you are kind of putting out there and saying that it's supposed to be accessible for everyone, but then maybe not realizing the different ways in which it's not. And so what do some of the rest of you think about that?
This is Sue. I may have to mute this. I'm working in the school building and this is dismissal time. So we might have interruptions. So I'm going to try to make this brief. For me personally, where I live and work at, 99.some% of the population here is all white. And so sometimes it's really kind of challenging for me because I've not really necessarily have been, in this position where I have to think so much about, color blindness or racial disparity or things like that. So it's kind of a hard conversation to have whenever you don't have a lot to go on as far as like experiencing that. So I just kind of want to put that out there. And so, but for me, I guess, whenever I think about a lot of things, being from Appalachia, a lot of times you can, like they talked about in the beginning, there's certain things that we feel like sometimes like how the other people look at us from Eastern Kentucky, and our self-efficacy is almost completely squashed immediately because we feel like the other people are going to look down on us no matter what we do to pull ourselves up. We're just from Eastern Kentucky and that's just the way it is. And so I guess I don't know if I should project that thought on anybody else, but sometimes I feel like if we feel like nobody has any expectations of us, and Rochelle Garrett at Berea College told me this one time, she said, expectations that other people have of us, we kind of adopt that sometimes. And I thought a lot about what she said. And I think the African-American community and also like the Appalachian community, both kind of feel that way. We've adopted, these expectations about ourselves and just, made it like for us. I know that some of our kids will leave here and they'll say, well, I'm just from Eastern Kentucky. Well, yeah, you are. Be happy and proud about that. But, sometimes they don't feel that way. And so I don't know if that impacts how other people are treated, but I'm going on my experience as far as being an Appalachian, you know, and but I kind of lack experience. I mean, dealing with a very diverse group of people. The most diversity we have here is social diversity and economic diversity. And so that's our big thing where I live at.
Okay, thank you for sharing, Sue. And so taking those statements into account and kind of reflecting back on your own experiences, how did the research support or challenge your thinking?
Are you directing that question at me or
the group as a whole? I apologize.
Okay.
I have
The floor is
something
open.
I'd like to share.
All right, go ahead, Yoko.
Okay, I am in Eastern Kentucky. I'm in Hindman, and I think I think 97% of the population is Caucasian here. And however, I think so we were talking about race, but it's actually about diversity. And we work with clients in recovery in our center, and that's one of our programs. And so the kind of the discrimination or the color blindness that comes out are within the same race or skin color, but it's about people who are suffering or have low expectations in the society. And while we are doing that within our own institution, there's some sensitivity levels that need improvement. And it could be as subtle as like, well, you know, they shouldn't come up to the store, or, well, they should just stay in a classroom and not travel around this building, or, you know, things like that. And those are the areas in which there is kind of like an hierarchy that is actually a lot more subtle and invisible, that comes out every now and then, that I feel that is something that is very necessary in training of the organization, if that's how we're going to try to make a difference. So I mean, I'm an Asian person, and so then they see it very directly, and I think they can be sensitive about it if they wanted to. However, if you do not have that visual, that people just are not aware and more bold in coming out and saying pretty insensitive things.
Daniel, this is Robert, and Yoko, I want to affirm that I've seen exactly the same thing you're describing in a lot of settings. Diversity is not really embraced in a lot of meetings and organizations. I really see this in when communities plan for their future and are trying to create a vision, a shared vision of what we can supposedly all work together. It's just kind of the nature of the beast in most places, probably, that a small number of people come up with that vision. And the lack of diversity is in part a failure, I think, for those who are sort of the progressive wing that wants to envision and plan reaching out. But it's so deeply ingrained that it's not enough just to, quote, reach out. It's so ingrained that these worlds operate side by side, but rarely together. So that, as Yoko was saying, you see people, but at the same time, you're thinking they don't really belong up in the gallery upstairs, or there are a lot of hidden biases. So where I see this working best is I have a friend named Mitzi Sennett, who does a lot of work in communities and with organizations, and she opens up people in her keynotes and in her art by reaching for people's hearts, you know, to touch the heart and get people to open up and feel what it would be like to be more colorblind in that broad sense. And by touching people's hearts, you have half a chance of getting past their conditioned reflexes. So I have learned a lot from being in workshops and stuff with her. But it's so widespread that it is almost invisible. The last thing I want to say is that in Eastern Kentucky, I don't see a lot of overt racism towards individuals, but neither do I see people, any of us, unpacking systems to see how the system discriminates. It's more like it's okay if we're friends, but I'm not really ready to unpack how the larger political system, economic system, education, whatever label you want to put on the opportunities that aren't as open to some as others. We just don't do that very much.
Thank you for sharing that, Robert. It also makes me think of intersectionality and how a lot of people don't often take that into context either, about the relation between not just race, but socioeconomic class or gender identity or sexuality, or all these different things and the way that they influence each other or often have an effect on someone's self-identity or perception or their place within these systems, right? And so unless anyone has anything else to add, I kind of would like you all to think back to your journaling prompt and what you've learned from this session that you plan to incorporate as you grow into your adaptive leadership. And so do I have any volunteers to talk about that a little bit? It doesn't have to be like this polished presentation to me. Just that's the whole point of journaling, right? Is just what are some of the thoughts that you've had and some of the things that you think you might want to do with this information.
Well,
what I put down here was that what has worked a little bit, if there was any sort of unaware inequity happening, is to immediately kind of personalize this person into like a real human, and that they have a story, and that you can identify with that person, instead of it being like a client number one and a client number two, or one of many, with whatever background that we don't want to think about. And that seems to help. And I think that's kind of close to what Robert was talking about, in touching people's hearts that way as fellow human, and not as some sort of like you are my worker or whatever. So.
Thank you. Rachel, I think you had something to say too.
Yeah, I was just gonna repeat what I said about how sometimes when it's people that are above you, in charge of you, that are making these decisions for the community, it might be best, and this is just me kind of thinking out loud, but for me as not only a community member, but somebody who kind of sees the inside of inner workings of government, city government, is that maybe I need to do my due diligence and research and reach out to, people that this is what they do. They go around and they have these hard, tough conversations with businesses, government workers, government leaders, instead of me, where for me, it might seem like it's coming from a place of attacking, whereas and if I bring someone in from the outside, it might seem that not so, I don't know the word I'm looking for, but like I'm trying to rock the boat when essentially I am, but it would maybe come from, it might be easier to digest from an expert.
I think for me, like, it's taken the the reputation and the relationships I've built in my community with the other community leaders, and standing up for what is the right thing to do. You know, if we're all honest in life, you tend to be attracted to want to be around people who are like you, who have, who may look like you, who may sound like you, who may have the same beliefs as you, whether it's politically, religious, or whatever, because that just makes life easier usually if everybody's in harmony and but that's not the world we live in, and you don't have to be in disharmony just because you believe different or you look different or you live differently than each other. And I think that I'm looking at it from my perspective, with working for a Main Street program, people have the same goal in common, and that's to make our community better. So I think that rather than to focus on anybody's differences, the most important thing is for, those of us, like speaking for myself, is to be able to stand up for those people and champion for them. Hey, they have the best interests at heart for our communities too, just like you do. And that creates that more diverse, seat at the table. And honestly, we get more done that way. It makes a better community because it's a better cross section of our community.
Boy, that is such a powerful statement, Julie. And I really do think that moving forward in our communities to figure out where our zones of agreement, what we share in common, what we want for the future, what we want for our children's future, we really need to identify how much we really do have in common with people that whether it's their political party, the color of their skin, their gender identification, whatever it might be, the more in common that we can recognize that we share, the better chance we have of coming to some kind of way of really communicating effectively. And right now, I just don't think we do that well. So I really love what you said.
Thank you, everyone, for sharing. I think we have about 1 or 2 more minutes left. If anyone has any last thoughts that they would like to share, or any questions for anyone else in the group, I do believe there will also be an opportunity to share out with the rest of the group once the breakout rooms close. But do we have any last thoughts anyone would like to share? The floor is open.
I want to share a little bit. I think it's for the doers in the community and who have kind of a vision to break out of the norm, to bring in these equitable thoughts. I think the definition of the better is a little bit different. And so some sort of a strategy for people to understand what the bigger better is important. And sometimes and I'm obviously from the outside coming in, there are things that I'm insensitive to, where I feel that why can't you see that this is obviously better, but that's so different from a different point of view. And so that's my learning area. And how do we bring it to a place where for that change and different way of thinking is actually better. So it's a communication within a bigger group of community in order for that to happen, and it does not happen overnight.
All right. Again, thank you all so much for sharing out. The breakout rooms are beginning to close. So at this point, you may choose to return to the main session. Thank you for your honesty and for being willing to participate, and for any emotional labor that you may have done with this conversation. I will see you all back in the main session. Thank you.
Thanks, Daniel.
All right, it looks like we are all back. It'd be good to use this time to share what we learned in our smaller groups with the larger group. But I would say, and I'm speaking a bit for Chad here too, but we could also take questions if anyone has any on our presentation as well. So both of those things would be optional for the time we have left. So does anyone want to share something that they took from the presentation, something that they took from the reading on color blindness? And actually, you know what, can we use the raise hands feature just because that seems to make it a whole lot easier to who's trying to say something.
And Dr. Klanderud, there was one question that came through the chat that asked about the different shades of color on the map that was in your presentation. And
oh, yes.
Meant something?
It does. So the dark gray, the darker black looking color was areas that were mostly sundown town. So you can take that as Black people were primarily expelled from that region as a whole. And the lighter gray was many sundown towns. So they don't, know for sure to the degree, it was not to the same degree as the darker gray sections, but it still was very heavily sundown town as well. So to me, that just was very striking when I looked at that and saw that really tracking right along the Appalachian region there. That to me was something that was a pretty important point that interestingly, the author of that particular study that I was using to look at didn't draw attention to Appalachia as a region, but instead the Cumberland Plateau. So it'd be interesting to kind of go back and look at some of the other research that's been done since and see how prevalent it was across Appalachia more broadly. So again, anyone want to share something that they are taking with them from our session or something that they took from the common reading that they'd like to share? Or just a question?
Oh, go ahead. Amy had her hand up. So
I have a question that's related to the material that you talked about, and it's a question about what I've seen in some of my other readings is about how affirmative action, the biggest beneficiary to affirmative action is white women. I was wondering if you could sort of explain how it helped a group that it wasn't designed to help primarily, or how did that happen?
Well, I will say to me, it's interesting, the idea that it wasn't designed to help white women primarily. I would say that it probably was. I think it's working how it was designed to work. So affirmative action programs basically gave companies breaks, and just from everything from tax breaks to different kinds of incentives to increase their hiring of a more diverse workforce. But the ways that a lot of those programs were really designed, it prioritized things like a college education, it prioritized things like skills training that were largely less available to African Americans, both men and women and other racialized minorities. And so basically what happened is the people that then qualified to be that affirmative action hire were largely middle class to upper working class white women who had the skills training to apply for those positions. So it did have some, I mean, there obviously, Berea College was putting out many of them, but Black college educated folks for a period of time. And then, later, obviously HBCUs were still college educating Black people when Berea College was unable to do so. But that kind of skills training was usually pretty necessary to get into those kind of affirmative action programs as well. And there just were much fewer of them. College education was limited for Black people for most of the 60s. So there were only some places that you could get a college education. Oh, Donna is telling folks, if you're trying to find out how to raise your hand, it's under the reactions button at the bottom of your screen, or just yell, we'll figure it out. Looks like Jose.
Yeah, thank you so much. I also just want to apologize in advance if it's a little bit loud. My internet at home is a little bit spotty at the moment because I'm moving. So I'm in a coffee shop right now. But with that being said, I think that the breakout rooms were really good and we had some really great conversations. And what I shared was that in the reading, I think it's table 1, I think on page 6, it was very interesting because that table, and also just throughout the reading, it kind of mentioned the spectrum of color blindness and how, there's high prejudice, low prejudice, and there's like, on the far left, or on one side, it's like antagonists who are like, it's a very high prejudice, and on the other side, it's like visionary, who are like people who are, I guess, want to be allies and use color blindness as like an excuse for allyship or see it that way. And so that was just really interesting to think about because in my head, I always thought of it just like kind of one thing. So seeing the spectrum was just very interesting because I've heard I've had experience with like color blindness my whole life, and so it's just been very confusing, and this will really help kind of put it together. So that's just what I wanted to bring up.
Yeah, and I would encourage you, if you haven't had a chance to look closely at the reading, to do so definitely. We kind of talked about that in my breakout room a bit, as there is interpersonal types of racism that thankfully I do think fewer people are demonstrating at this point, but that doesn't mean that you can't still be participating in systems and structures that are racist. That has nothing to do with your being a good, nice, kind, well thought of person, but you are, still participating in structures that are hurting people. Looking for raised hands or just shouted questions. Jacqueline.
In the breakout room that I was in, the concept that kept coming up was this understanding people's lived experiences and valuing them for their lived experiences and the current realities. A resource that came up that I thought was really interesting to hear about came up from Brandy from Prevent Child Abuse Kentucky, who shared about participating in a racial wealth gap simulation that helps her better understand the current landscape and just historical inequities that led there, and understanding the landscape will better help her and other people in her organization better serve the people that they serve. So I just thought that was an interesting resource to share, and yeah, it's something that came up.
Yeah, that's a great thing to point out. Like, for example, a lot of people don't know, when you think about like Social Security, and it's this thing we pay into, you get your Social Security check when you are retiree age. Doesn't count for domestic work, doesn't count for tip laborers for a long time. And so a lot of these positions that were predominantly African-American never were included in Social Security, and they were not included in Social Security quite on purpose, because at that time, Southern Congress people vetoed the inclusion of farm workers and domestic service workers in the Social Security program. And so again, this is a way of excluding primarily African-American and primarily Latinx folks from this kind of basic social safety net that we have in the United States.
And I must say that because my grandparents were white sharecroppers at the time, they too were excluded and suffered as a result. So it's another example of why equity leads to a better society for all.
Yeah, because these programs would have been a significant part of poverty relief, generally speaking. And they frequently get vetoed because of their perceived disproportionate advance for Black people when they would also help poor white folks as well. Remember, the way math works, just because Black people are, they're only 13% of the population. So even every program that is helping people that tend to be more poor actually helps more white people than it does Black people, just because there's more of them. That is how the population works.
Wanted to bring up that let's not also, when we talk about poverty and neglect, let's also not think that there's equality and equity with that, because those people have to be very creative thinkers. And when we're working in the Appalachian population, sometimes you have a choice. If you don't have transportation, your Walmart is your Minute Mart on the corner. Well, you pay $6 for noodles versus $1 at Walmart. So in working with children and families and any nonprofit, as I said earlier, we have to not confuse neglect and poverty, and trying to educate people on that as well. So when you do your work, I learned last week that, people always want to talk about financial literacy. Well, that is very degrading and upsetting to people that don't have any money. There is nothing to budget when you don't have anything coming in. So the last thing you want to do with poverty-stricken families is say, well, we need to get you into a financial literacy program. Not so much if you don't have the means to feed the children that you're caring for or the family. So I just wanted to bring that up because that brings up something else that we're not even talking about, but it also does have to do with equity versus equality. Mm-hmm. So my grocery store might look different than yours because of a transportation issue or what have you.
Yep, can't get blood out of a stone, my grandma used to say. All right, Donna, question or comment?
Or comment. I thought I'd share a little bit about what we talked about in our small group. And we talked some about naming the challenge and the importance of we didn't really say how you name the challenge, but I think that is part of it. And this idea of creating a shared understanding of what the challenge really is among all the different populations that are involved in that challenge or impacted by that challenge. And so the adaptive piece of that has to do with creating that shared understanding, which can take a lot of time and effort, I think. If I think about that as someone who works in community with community groups and doing community development, it's not a fast process, it's a slow process. And so there's that piece of it. And then another thing that came up was just the idea of having genuine curiosity, which doesn't mean going up to a person of color and saying to them, tell me what it's like to be a person of color, but to also have genuine curiosity about the way that you're feeling and the way that you're receiving people. And equipping people in the programming, and this was another person who shared this, who does programming for sort of leadership programming, but that it's about being curious about ourselves as well as about the other people and working on that in both ways.
Well, and related to what we talked about in my breakout room as well, I think that we need to give each other space to learn. It's always a challenge. And I think people back out of these conversations frequently because they're afraid of making a mistake and afraid of being called the R word. And, there is quite a lot of information available to those who want to look. And so, it is, I think, incumbent on people of goodwill to do that work, to try to learn what they can, ask questions. But as you said, to do it with a spirit of curiosity and openness, and not to be proven right, but to, kind of learn from a place of humility and, yeah, I'm probably going to mess up, but let me keep working at building a relationship here. And that's, that is seeing the other person for who they are and not seeing the stereotype and not, and also not being colorblind. You are learning to see the person for who they are. And I think that's very important. Yeah, listening to understand versus listening to respond. Exactly. All right, Robert, looks like your hand is up.
Sorry, it took me a second to unmute. So to your point, Jessica, I think you answered some of what I'm about to say, which is that in some circles of conversation talking about systems and how you can be implicit in supporting a system that is racist or discriminatory, even though as a person or even with your circle of friends, you're quite loving and supportive. But what I find is that in a lot of settings, whether multicultural or monocultural, as soon as you start talking about systems, people tune out. And it's very difficult to find the right language to talk about systems without there kind of being a negative presumption that you're off on some crusade or that you've got an agenda or what have you. And I don't know exactly why that is. I mean, I have some thoughts about it, but I think what's more interesting is in our group, one person in particular said that we should look for zones of agreement and things that we share in common first before delving into systems conversations. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts or perspectives on that that would be helpful to us.
I think that can help. I think one thing that I would say that is perhaps different comes out of my particular experience as a Black woman in the United States, which is it's very common for folks to assign a kind of stereotypical and monolithic identity to any minoritized racial population, by which I mean this idea that like all Black people are alike. And just like you wouldn't say that, I don't think, about all white people, it's the exact same scenario for Black people as well. It's like we come from different places, have different heritage, different background, different ideas. And so there's an immense diversity within the Black community that I don't think gets recognized as much as I would kind of like. And I think for me, that comes from, I come from a rural experience. I come from the forest and the hills. I don't come from the city. And so when people assume an urban experience for me, that's always really strange because I just really don't understand that world in the same way. And so for many people, when they see Black person, they think urban. And that's not consistent with my experience. So that would be one thing that I think speaks a bit to that particular conversation is I think often when we're talking about systems, it can get kind of stereotypical on both sides of the equation there. And that's something I think that is generally to be avoided. But I also think people sort of deeply want racism to be a function of an interpersonal relationship only. When we start talking about racial systems, systems are much harder to tear apart. They're much harder to break down because, gosh, I mean, lots of folks in this call are probably traditionalists. You know, we've always done it that way. Why would we do it a different way? That's just the way we do it. And, you know, that's a system in a way. It's not a good system or a bad system. It's a system. And I think that, you know, when we start talking about dismantling systems, people get really uncomfortable, where it's much easier to sort of say, well, you just need to be nice to people who are different than you. That's a much easier fix than, you know, we've got a banking system, for example, that continues to use patterns that are discriminatory to decide who to lend to and who not to. So that would be, and that's hopefully not a too tongue-in-cheek sort of response to your question. But I think that's why the push for so many is to make it interpersonal, because interpersonal we can fix. Systems sometimes feel too big.
It's why a racial equity organization that I work with always starts the conversation with the metaphor of going to a lake and seeing a fish that has died. And you think, oh, that poor fish, something must have happened to it. If you go back the next day and you look and see thousands of fish in the same lake dead, then you begin to understand that there must be something wrong with the water in which the fish were living. And thereby getting the notion of the individual level versus the systemic of groundwater that is toxic.
Jessica, one other thing that you may not have the answer to, I'm probably asking you a big question here, but our implicit bias, that they say that happens in unconscious thoughts and actions. And a lot of times that's because how we've been programmed, maybe in our upbringing, or we know media is not our friend on that end, and culture and so forth. But they talk about debiasing. And that's in all aspect, of your life, your circles, you have the different parts of your wheel. Do you have suggestions on how do you do that? Because I think a lot of times we will think someone thinks this because of their actions, but it's, again, the implicit bias. It's almost an unconscious behavior.
I would say, first off, Brandy, I am a historian by training. I am not, professional in these sorts of areas. I'm good at knowing when to refer. So that is something that I would suggest, working with someone who has more training specifically in how to approach debiasing. Yeah. I'm interested in that kind of concept as an idea. But I will say, as an example, both of my parents are one of 7 children and 8 children respectively. And I remember many times going back to the family kind of homestead and being absolutely shocked at watching my very kind of independent and self-reliant parents revert to their childhood roles when in the company of their siblings almost immediately. So I know that those kind of things you grow up with as a part of your life are very hard to undo, even when you sort of know better. So I think that is something that conscious relationship building is really an important part of, because stereotypes are much easier to believe when you don't have relationships with the people that you need to know in order to not have those stereotypes. So that would be, I would refer on in that case for the most part, but I do know that those kind of unconscious behaviors can be very hardwired into everybody's programming.
Thank you for commenting.
I see Martina's hand up.
Yes. I also think about accessibility in spaces when we talk about equity, in terms of, if you're in a community where you have a growing Latinx population, but you don't see engagement from that community, do you have, materials that reflect that language? Is it, do you have things that reflect their culture as well, in those spaces that allow for people to see that it's welcoming? I think about also, like, not just culturally speaking, but learning spaces for all different types of learning, for folks who may have disabilities. You're constantly having to adapt your way of understanding what is accessible to people when it comes to equity, and getting out of the space of how would I operate in this, and thinking about how would someone else, what would this look like for them? And going to that person or partner as just getting their experience as them being the subject matter expert. You might have the technical skill of curating something, but they can provide maybe feedback as to, does this reflect, a narrative that they can relate to, while also keeping in mind, it's not a monolith, but it's just one narrative. When we're thinking about meetings and community events and things like that, that's what I keep hearing to resonate in the group that I facilitated, but also here in this space today too.
Yeah, like a simple idea that I think of sometimes is, in the religious community that I grew up with, if someone would have scheduled a community talk in the afternoon, none of the people from my church would have come, because it was tradition to have, a big meal after church, and then kind of the second round of service started after 1 o'clock. So if you were wanting me there at 1 o'clock, that wasn't going to happen. You needed to have it at like 3 in order for people to be able to get there, from services. So Madeline?
I just wanted to add to that. I agree with Martina's point. And that's why I feel like when we do service work, any type of service work, or we're engaging with the community and we're trying to be an equitable society, it's important to do a needs assessment to see what that community needs, because they're probably going to know what they need better than you. Even an outsider, especially if you're an outsider or somebody who is deemed to have the expertise or the education to go in, the people in the situation you're trying to help know they need whatever help they need better than you do. So maybe there could be some cultural things to think about. Like she was saying, some ways to present yourself and be visible so that people can know that they're welcomed in that space and that belongs to them. So I feel like in the same way, when we do that, a community or a group or whoever we're trying to work with, then it's personal to them, and then they're able to say, okay, this is our thing. It's not someone coming in to do something for us that they think would help. This is, they have a vested interest in whatever it is they're trying to do for themselves.
Yes, definitely. That's always important. The more you can partner with local leaders and local folks, they've often been doing the work for a while, so it's good to check in with those people as well. We're running low on time, so I think, Mark, you're going to be our last question/comment of the session.
Wow, this has been really wonderful. Thank you, everybody. I just wanted to go back, and it builds off of what we just heard, but the idea, Jessica, that you said conscious relationship building. And that seems to be a real key from various researchers and various platforms and frameworks. This idea of intentional, like what Robert was talking about, community accelerators, conscious relationship builders. And it seems that all matches up with a continuum of intercultural development that, as you know, Jessica, the IDI platform talks about, that in that stage of minimization, it's all about to progress past the color blindness that people have at that stage. It's building relationship to de-bias people. And so I just wanted to reiterate that. So thank you.
Yeah, and I think that it's going to be a challenge. It's not going to be easy, but I think that it's work that we all can do to help bring us closer together. And I think that's a good goal. All right, Donna, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, well, thank you. And what a wonderful conversation, everybody. I so hated to say we got to cut it off because we want to try to get you out of here as close to 3:30 as we can. We just have a couple of other things that we want to do. And one of them, I'm going to share my screen actually just now. One of them is something that we do each year as part of the Leadership Summit. And close those down. Okay. And so each year we provide an award to somebody who has been of significant service to Brushy Fork, of significant service to the Appalachian region. This award is named after John B. Stevenson, who was president of Berea College when he founded the Brushy Fork Institute back in 1988. And so So we have named this award in honor of him to signify him as our founder. And so the person to whom we're going to award this year actually got to know Brushy Fork in the mid-1990s when we were transitioning away from our first major grant that funded our work. She was a member of an advisory board that we formed to help us determine how to keep the program sustainable and over the next 30 years, essentially, you know, because we're about 33 years old now. And her work helped us with that sustainability. She served as a primary connection for deepening Brushy Fork's leadership development work in West Virginia in the 1990s and the early 2000s. She represented Brushy Fork for our first grant with the Benedum Foundation. She also created a community mini grants program in West Virginia. And her approach to this program was to use a peer group micro enterprise lending strategy to provide grants that were pretty small. They were like $500 to $2,000 a piece. And they went to community organizations for projects that were too small for regular foundations to fund. And over the years, that program planted seeds throughout West Virginia, and there is probably some remaining piece of work in every county in West Virginia that was funded. So those seeds weren't just for money, they were also to build skills that led to communities being able to raise funds for larger projects. For example, in one community, they were able to raise money, $100,000 at the time, to buy a new fire truck because that community needed a new fire truck. In 1993, she received the Robert W. Scribner Award for creative and effective grant making from the National Council on Foundations, because those seeds were planted pretty much in every community in West Virginia, every county. So I'm going to go ahead and now will my PowerPoint work? So each year what we try to do is there is a painting that we present to the John B. Stevenson Award winner. And so because we have talked about the fact that this person has planted seeds in pretty much every community, every county in West Virginia, she's actually planted seeds here at Brushy Fork, kept us going. After her retirement, she has led multiple workshops for us in everything from women in leadership to executive level decision-making for nonprofits. She has served as a sounding board for me as director. One of the things about adaptive leadership is that you don't go into that alone, and having a sounding board and somebody to support you is very important. And she has a propensity for coaching, and my leadership of Brushy Fork has benefited because of her. And so I would like to honor Caroline Carpenter, who actually is going to be leading a workshop track for us again this year. She is a planter of seeds that are scattered throughout far and wide in Appalachia, that are scattered throughout the lives of people that she's touched through the trainings that she has done. And that actually the Leadership Summit that you are attending today is one of those seeds that she scattered when she actually went to the Kellogg Foundation and worked there for a number of years. She provided the initial grant for planning for the Brushy Fork Leadership Institute at the time. It was the annual institute. We have renamed it the Leadership Summit. But I guess here's our applause for Caroline Carpenter. Well, I'm very proud to present her with the John B. Stevenson Service Award for 2021. So thank you all. And I hope some folks got into Caroline's workshop track. So now, but the last thing before we leave is I want to quickly run through our schedule the rest of this week. We have our Block 1 workshop tracks, parts 1 and parts 2 on Tuesday and Wednesday. So if you are in a workshop track in Block 1, and we'll go over in a minute what those workshop tracks are, then you'll be back with us from 9 to noon Eastern time tomorrow and the next day. If you're in a Block 2 workshop track, you're going to be back with us on Thursday and Friday from 9 to noon. And again, those workshop tracks in Block 1 are strengths-based leadership. So you'll be back with us tomorrow. If you're in Mark Nigro's track, Mark's on the call. Wave at everybody, Mark. Harnessing the power and not knowing, Caroline is leading that track. Equity in context, reflecting on who we are, acting on where we want to be. Kiera Clark and Micah Anderson from MDC in North Carolina are going to be leading that track. So those are our Block 1 workshop tracks that are taking place tomorrow and Wednesday from 9 to noon. Workshop tracks in Block 2, we have 2 of those. Heather Schill, who I think may still be on the call, is doing adaptive programming. She's going to talk about some lean processes. And then Maddie Day and Julie Weingard are going to be leading a workshop track along with a group of young people that they have co-planned this track with on sharing power and co-designing for equitable results, and specifically talking about engaging youth in community work. So then next week we are back again. We tried to break this out over multiple days, multiple weeks, so that we wouldn't have to be online for hours at a time. Our keynote address, we don't want you to miss, well, there's 2 things here, actually, we don't want you to miss. The first is this Spoonbread Networking Plenary. If you requested that we send you Spoonbread, this is your chance to bake up that Spoonbread and join us for a networking session at noon on Tuesday, September 21st. And then we'll take a break after that session, and we will have our keynote address with Jeff Canada, who is founder of the Harlem Children's Zone. You do not want to miss the opportunity to hear Jeff Canada speak. He is very engaging. He is very enthusiastic and passionate about what he does, and you will leave that session feeling good. So join us for that keynote address at 2:30, and that'll wrap up about 3:30. So that's about an hour for that plenary. And then we'll be back into our workshop tracks again. We have the Block 3 workshop tracks on the 22nd, that's Wednesday, and Thursday the 23rd from 9 to noon again. So if you're in those Block 3 tracks, then be sure to be back for those. And then we are going to do a wrap-up session. And I know folks are probably going, oh, we've been in sessions all week. Why should we come back on a Friday? This is our closing session for that Community Accelerator. So we heard from Grayson at the opening session today. And this is where we want to bring back to them and gift them get words of wisdom or things that you have learned from your workshop track. So please come back to the Community Accelerator closing session. And also, we're going to share a little bit about some of the future development with Brushy Fork and some plans that we have for the future. And so if you're in those Block 3 workshop tracks, then you have got moving from talk to action, results-based accountability with Andy Beekler and Thomas Johnson, strategies for private and public funding development with Dr. Melissa Newman, and building a local leadership table for collaborative impact with Katie Basham and Dr. Shanda Crowder, who is with the Annie E. Casey Foundation. So if you have questions, please reach out. Daniel has been kind enough to share their cell phone with us. And so there's his number there, 304-880-0635. If you have a desperate question and need to answer it, that's a quick way to get a hold of Daniel. Andrea is also sharing a cell phone number, 859-626-2163, or email us at brushyfork@berea.edu. Or feel free to email me at danielsd@berea.edu, and I will get the question out to whoever needs to answer that. So we hope you will be back with us tomorrow for your workshop track. If you have any questions, then please feel free to reach out. And thank you for joining us today. And sorry for being over for a few minutes, but couldn't stop that conversation earlier. It was a good one. Thanks, everybody. See you tomorrow.